There's a moment just before your entire life shifts direction where everything looks completely ordinary. The coffee's too hot, the chair's uncomfortable, the snow outside won't quit. Vivian Hale had built a billion-dollar company by age 30, but on Christmas Eve, sitting alone in a crowded cafe, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, completely, humiliatingly invisible. She almost left. She had her coat on, her keys were already in her hand, and then the door slammed open, and a man covered in snow stumbled inside with wild eyes and shaking hands. And whatever she thought this night would be, it wasn't this. If you've ever had one moment change the entire shape of your future, drop a like, follow along to the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The reservation had been for 7. It was now 7:52. Vivian Hale knew this not because she'd been checking her phone every few minutes, though she had, but because the cafe's wall clock was directly in her line of sight, and she had memorized the exact sound its second hand made when it swept past the 12. A faint, almost imperceptible click. She'd counted approximately 3,000 of those clicks since she sat down. She hadn't meant to count. She just couldn't stop. The cafe was called Linden and Frost, which was the kind of name that sounded charming in a text message and slightly precious in person. It occupied the ground floor of a converted brownstone on Mercer Street, all exposed brick and Edison bulbs and chalkboard menus written in a handwriting so deliberately imperfect it circled back around to studied. On any other night, Vivian might have appreciated the atmosphere. Tonight, the Edison bulbs felt like they were aimed specifically at her face, and every person who glanced over from the bar, and several had, felt like a small, private indictment. The CEO who couldn't get a man to show up on time. She pushed the thought away, picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. The woman at the next table, early 40s, red scarf, the specific kind of patient expression that belonged to someone waiting for a friend who was always late, caught Vivian's eye by accident and offered a small, sympathetic smile. Vivian looked away immediately. She did not want sympathy. She did not want to be the woman at the corner table who'd been smiled at sympathetically. She'd worn the navy dress. That was the detail that kept snagging at her, the way a hem catches on a nail. She'd worn the navy dress, which she never wore, which she'd bought 18 months ago for a charity gala and hadn't found another occasion for since. Rachel had said, wear something that doesn't look like you're about to give a quarterly earnings presentation. And Vivian had stood in her closet for 20 minutes and finally pulled out the navy dress because it was the one thing hanging there that she genuinely couldn't remember buying, which seemed, at the time, like a good sign, like it existed outside her usual architecture of calculated choices. Now it just meant she was underdressed and cold and had been stood up in a dress she didn't even recognize. She pulled out her phone, opened the message thread with Rachel. "He's not here," she typed. Deleted it. Typed, "I'm leaving in 5 minutes." Deleted that too. What she wanted to type was something that accurately conveyed the specific texture of this humiliation. Not the grand, dramatic kind she could metabolize quickly, but the small, grinding kind that just sat there. And she couldn't find the words for that, so she put her phone face down on the table and looked at the clock again. 7:54. She'd give it until 8. That was the number she'd already decided on 40 minutes ago, and she'd revised it twice, and she was done revising it. Her name was Vivian Hale. She ran Halcyon Group, a mid-sized private investment firm that had made her very comfortable and a few of her early clients extraordinarily wealthy. She had 17 people reporting to her, a standing Thursday morning meeting that no one was ever late to, and a personal reputation for the kind of efficient decisiveness that made board members exhale with relief when she entered a room. She did not sit in cafes being stood up, except that was exactly what she was doing, and had been doing for almost an hour. And the only reason she hadn't left already was a combination of stubbornness and the persistent, irrational hope that there was an explanation that wasn't, he simply didn't come. Rachel had set this up. Rachel, who was her oldest friend, who knew better than anyone that Vivian didn't do blind dates, who had spent the better part of 3 months making the case for Owen Cross with the sustained enthusiasm of someone presenting a very strong business proposal. "He's not your usual type," Rachel had said, which Vivian had understood to mean not the carefully selected, interchangeable parade of investment bankers and corporate attorneys who looked good across a dinner table and never once surprised her. "Tell me about him," Vivian had said, The way you agree to look at something you've already mostly decided not to buy. He's a single dad. His son is 8. He lost his wife a few years ago. Rachel, he's smart, Viv. Not in a showy way. In the way where you're 10 minutes into a conversation and you realize you've been leaning forward. What does he do? A pause. Rachel's pauses were themselves a form of communication. He works building maintenance. Vivian had been quiet. I knew you were going to do that, Rachel said. I didn't do anything. You went quiet. That's your thing. You go quiet and you start calculating, and then you give me some completely reasonable sounding explanation for why it won't work. And the real reason is that you're scared of something that doesn't fit the plan. I'm not scared of a building maintenance technician, Rachel. Then meet him, Christmas Eve, Linden and Frost, 7 o'clock. She'd said yes, mostly to stop the conversation. And then, somewhere between the initial agreement and actually putting on the navy dress, she'd started to want to go. Which was the part she hadn't told Rachel. Which was, perhaps, the part that made sitting here alone at 7:55 feel like more than a minor inconvenience. She was gathering her coat when the door opened. Not a gentle cafe door swing. A sudden, forceful push that let in a gust of cold air sharp enough that the couple nearest the entrance both flinched. The small bell above the door, presumably decorative, rang twice. The man who came through was tall. She registered that first. And he was covered in snow. Not dusted. Covered. Like he'd been outside long enough for it to accumulate and then hadn't thought to brush it off before coming inside. His jacket was dark wool, inadequate for the weather. He had dark hair and he was breathing hard, the kind of breathing that came after running, and his eyes were scanning the room with a frantic, searching quality that had nothing to do with looking for a blind date. He found her. She didn't know how. They'd never met, had only exchanged one brief phone call that afternoon to confirm the reservation. But his eyes found her and he crossed the room in about 6 long steps, and up close she could see that his face was pale beneath a flush of cold, and his hands, when he pulled out the chair across from her, were not quite steady. You're Vivian, he said. It wasn't a question. I am, she said. And you're Owen. I'm sorry. He sat down heavily, ran both hands over his face. I'm really sorry. I know what time it is. I don't have a good excuse for being this late. I need a second. He wasn't making excuses. That was the thing she noticed, cutting through all her prepared coldness. He wasn't offering her a rehearsed apology or a smooth explanation. He was sitting across from her looking like a man who had just come down from a very high ledge, and he needed a moment, and he was being completely straightforward about that. She sat back down. A server appeared. Owen ordered a coffee without looking at the menu. Vivian ordered another for something to do with her hands. Okay, he said after a moment. His breathing was steadier. Okay. My son, Ethan, he's 8. He was at his school's holiday thing this afternoon. A winter fair, whatever they call it. I dropped him off at 2 and I was supposed to pick him up at 5. He paused, looked at the table. At 4:30, I got a call from one of the other parents saying she couldn't find him. And then the teacher couldn't find him. And then I drove there and they had 2 staff members and 4 parents looking, and he wasn't in the building and he wasn't on the grounds. And it was snowing and he didn't have his good coat because he'd left it at school last week, and the coat they gave him was... He stopped. Sorry, you don't need the whole... Where was he? Vivian asked. Owen looked up. Something in her directness seemed to settle him, like it gave him a handhold. He'd followed the school's cat. There's a cat that lives in the maintenance shed behind the school. I actually know it. I've done some work in that building. And apparently Ethan decided the cat shouldn't be alone on Christmas Eve. A short, fractured sound came out of him that might have been a laugh under better circumstances. He'd been in the shed for almost 2 hours. He'd made the cat a little bed out of his scarf. He had no idea anyone was looking for him. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Is he okay? He's fine. He's home. My neighbor's with him. Owen wrapped both hands around the coffee cup the server had set down. He thought it was completely reasonable. I had to explain for about 45 minutes why it was not reasonable. And then he cried, and then I almost cried, which I refused to do in front of him. And then I called Mrs. Patton from next door, and I drove here, and... He looked at her for the first time in a sustained way. You've been sitting here for almost an hour. I have, she said. I almost called to cancel. Why didn't you? Because Rachel told me you'd agreed to come, and I figured that cost you something, and it seemed wrong to cancel by text. He looked slightly embarrassed by this, which is maybe a stupid reason to drive across the city on Christmas Eve. Vivian studied him. He had, she decided, the face of someone who'd spent a long time being primarily responsible for things. Not hardened by it, not closed off, but weighted in a way that was different from the men she usually sat across from at dinner. Those men carried ambition on their faces, or ego, or the specific careful pleasantness of someone who wanted something from her. Owen Cross just looked like himself, as far as she could tell, which was either completely uncalculated or so deeply calculated it was indistinguishable from the real thing. She didn't think it was calculated. "Tell me about the cat," she said. He blinked. "What?" "The cat. The one Ethan followed." Something shifted in his expression. The tight, still recovering look loosened slightly. "Orange tabby. Goes by... I don't know if cats actually go by names, but the maintenance guys call her Biscuit. She's been there about 4 years. She's not friendly, as a rule. Ethan's been feeding her through the fence since September." He shook his head. "He's been doing it in secret because he thought I'd tell him to stop, which I probably would have." "Would you have told him to stop?" "I'd have worried about the hygiene angle, yeah. Cat living in a maintenance shed, 8-year-old boy, school policy on animals." He caught her expression. "You think I'm describing myself as a worse parent than I am?" "I think you're very concerned with the liability." He laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, and it changed his face. "I work in buildings. Everything is a liability. It's a professional deformation." The tension in Vivian's chest, which she'd been carrying for an hour and hadn't fully acknowledged, did something odd. Not disappeared, just shifted into something that wasn't quite tension anymore. She'd come prepared for an awkward evening with a man who was wrong for her in every measurable way. She had a whole internal architecture of this: polite interest, careful questions, the gracious exit she'd constructed around 10 o'clock. She had not prepared for this. A man who'd spent 2 hours terrified for his son, who'd still shown up because he thought her time had value, who'd been honest about being wrecked without performing it. She hadn't prepared to be surprised. They ordered food eventually. She'd already eaten from the breadbasket out of stress, which she didn't mention, and he ordered a sandwich with the direct focus of someone who'd forgotten to eat since noon. "How long have you been doing maintenance work?" she asked. "About 6 years. Before that I was in project management, construction side, smaller firm." He picked up his coffee, set it down. When my wife died, Ethan was 3. I needed something with more predictable hours, less travel. The maintenance work, I can set my own schedule mostly. The buildings I work with have known me for years, so there's flexibility." "What kind of buildings?" "Commercial mostly. 2 office towers downtown, a hotel on 5th, a couple of residential high-rises." He said it without emphasis, just facts. "It's not glamorous, but I know those buildings the way I know my apartment. Every system, every quirk. There's something..." He paused, looking for the word. "There's something satisfying about that. Knowing something completely." Vivian thought about the buildings she owned shares of and couldn't have described in any detail beyond square footage and occupancy rates. "What made you good at project management?" she asked. It was the kind of question she asked in interviews, clean and slightly oblique, and she was aware of using it, but she was also genuinely curious. He thought about it. "I'm good at seeing how things are actually connected as opposed to how they're supposed to be connected. On paper, a construction project has a critical path, a sequence of dependencies that tells you what has to happen before what. In practice, there are about 40 informal dependencies the schedule doesn't account for. The crane operator who only trusts one signal crew. The inspector who'll pass work faster if you submit on Tuesdays. The supplier whose delivery window is technically 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., but actually means you need someone on site at 6:45 or the truck leaves." He looked slightly self-conscious. "Sorry, that's not interesting to most people." "It's very interesting," Vivian said, and meant it. He looked at her like he was checking whether she was being polite. "I run a firm," she said. "We manage capital. The formal structure of how decisions are supposed to get made and the actual structure of how they get made are completely different things. The people who are good at what I do are the ones who figured that out. She paused. Most people find it threatening when I say that. Most people who find that threatening are probably in the official structure, he said. She picked up her wine glass. Exactly. There was a moment, a small one, barely a pause, where they looked at each other with the mutual recognition of people who have just found an unexpected match on something specific. It was not romantic, precisely, not yet. It was more like a calibration. Rachel says you're divorced, Owen said. Then immediately, sorry, she mentioned it. I shouldn't just... It's fine. Vivian set her glass down. Not divorced. I was engaged. 7 years ago. We made it to 6 weeks before the date. She said it the same way she said most things, clear, no decoration. He took a position in Singapore. I wasn't going to move. He knew I wasn't going to move. I think we both knew, by that point, that we were finishing something that had already ended. The announcement just made it official. That's a hard way to end something. It was the right way to end it. A bad marriage would have been harder. True, he said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding whether to say the next thing. With Claire, it wasn't a bad marriage. The hard thing afterward was that it was a good one. Is a good one. I don't know how the grammar works on that. He looked at the table. You don't get to be angry at something that was good. No, she said softly. You don't. Ethan looks like her, around the eyes. He picked up his fork, put it down without using it. He's also nothing like her in about 20 other ways, which means he's probably just himself, but sometimes I see it and it's... He stopped. I'm not sure why I'm telling you that. I asked about your life, Vivian said. You're telling me about your life. Most people want the summary version. I don't want the summary version. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, through the cafe window, the snow was still coming down, heavier now, the streetlights haloed with it, the sidewalk outside completely white. A couple past the window huddled together under one umbrella, moving fast. Can I ask what you do? Owen said. Rachel gave me about 3 sentences. Investment firm. I manage capital for high net worth clients and mid-size institutional funds. We're not the biggest firm in the city, but we have a specific niche in infrastructure and energy transition. How'd you get into that? My father was an engineer. I grew up understanding that everything runs on physical systems. Power, water, transport. Most finance people see those as invisible. I see them as the whole point. She paused. I started in corporate banking, hated it, and spent 2 years building something I could run the way I thought it should be run. How old were you when you started? 26. He was quiet for a second. That's young, I know. People mention it a lot. I was going to say that's before I'd figured out how to file my taxes correctly. She smiled. What happened with your taxes? I claimed my truck as a business expense in a year where I was technically employed by someone else, and my accountant looked at me with the specific face of a person choosing not to ask follow-up questions. Vivian's laugh came out before she could moderate it. Not the measured, appropriate version she used in professional settings, but the actual one, shorter and more surprised. Owen looked briefly startled, then pleased. I got it sorted, he added. Eventually. The server came, cleared plates, asked about dessert. They both said no simultaneously, and then looked at each other. The cafe had thinned out, 2 tables occupied besides theirs, the bar still busy. The clock on the wall said 9:23, which meant they'd been sitting here for almost an hour and a half, and she hadn't thought about the time once. Owen excused himself to call his neighbor and check on Ethan, and while he was gone, Vivian sat with her wine and tried to examine what she was feeling with the same clinical honesty she brought to everything else. She was having a good time. That was the simple, undeniable fact of it. Not politely. Not because she was making the best of a situation. Actually having a good time, with a man she'd expected to spend an hour with out of social obligation and then never think about again. He wasn't what she'd constructed in her head. She'd been expecting something. Not bad. She wasn't that unfair, but something manageable. An earnest, slightly boring man she could feel warmly toward without any particular risk. Someone who would confirm, gently, why she'd remained mostly alone for 7 years and would continue to do so. Owen Cross was not managing to confirm that theory. He came back to the table with his phone still in his hand and a particular expression that was recognizable as the face of a parent who has just done a check-in and is recalibrating a worry level downward. "He's fine," Owen said. "Mrs. Patton says he's had dinner and he's watching something with animated dogs and he keeps telling her about the cat." "He's probably already named it," Vivian said. Owen sat down, gave her a look. "He has in fact proposed the name Captain Butterscotch." "That's an excellent name." "That is a deeply terrible name, and I'm going to have to live with it for the rest of my life." He settled back in his chair. "He's going to ask if we can adopt a cat." "Are you going to say yes?" "I've been holding the line on that for 2 years." He looked at the table. "I'm going to crack. I can already feel it." "You were always going to crack," Vivian said. "I know." He said it with a kind of resigned peace, the peace of a man who knows which battles he's going to lose and has made something like a decision to be okay with it. "Anyway, he's fine." "Good." She meant it. She was surprised by how much she meant it. "He'd like to meet you, by the way." Owen looked briefly uncertain, like he hadn't intended to say that. I mentioned I was going to dinner with someone. He asked if it was a friend or a lady friend. Those are his categories." "Which did you say?" "I said I didn't know yet." He met her eyes. Which was true. The honesty of it landed somewhere it shouldn't have, given that this was the first time they'd met, and the relationship, such as it was technically about 45 minutes old. And yet. "How do you manage it?" Vivian asked. She wasn't sure exactly what she meant by the question, but he seemed to understand it anyway. "Badly sometimes," he said. "That's the honest answer. There are weeks where I'm doing okay, but got the schedule worked out. Ethan's happy, works fine, I've slept enough. And there are weeks where I'm running on about 4 hours and Ethan's having a hard time at school and I haven't done laundry in 10 days, and I stand in the kitchen at 7 a.m. looking at the coffee maker like I need it to give me instructions." He paused. "And then there are moments where he does something, says something, or figures something out, and I think, okay, we're going to be fine. This is actually fine." "Like tonight," Vivian said, "with the cat." "Like tonight." He shook his head. He was so proud of himself for taking care of that cat. He wasn't scared. He wasn't upset. He'd solved a problem. In his head, he'd done the right thing, and it had just taken everyone else a while to figure that out. A pause. "I couldn't actually be angry at that. I tried." He looked at me with those completely sincere eyes and said, "But Dad, she was alone on Christmas Eve and He stopped. "He's a better person than me. That's the secret I'm keeping." Vivian thought about something. She'd been thinking about it in a peripheral way since he'd mentioned being at a school, since he'd mentioned the maintenance shed at the back of the building. Something about the way he described knowing a building by its systems, not the surface, but what ran underneath, had moved a loose piece of memory without quite catching it. She set it aside. It was probably nothing. "I read a paper recently," she said, changing direction, "about infrastructure investment patterns in cities that have diversified their maintenance contracts versus cities that haven't. The differential in emergency repair costs over 15 years is substantial, like embarrassingly substantial, given how easy the fix is." He looked at her. "You read infrastructure investment papers for fun." "I read them for work, but also," she considered. "Yes, for fun." That's the most specific thing anyone has ever said to me on a date. Was it too specific? No. He smiled, a real one, not the polite version. It's the most interesting thing anyone said to me on a date in about 3 years. What did people say before that? A lot of very careful questions. You could tell they'd read articles about how to talk to widowers. There were a lot of articles. Everyone had done the reading. Vivian considered this. "I haven't done the reading." "I know," he said. "It's good." The cafe was quieter now. The snow outside had softened from heavy to steady, the thick, constant kind that would be beautiful by morning if you didn't have to drive in it. Vivian became aware of having lost track of time again, not as a problem, just as a fact, and checked her phone and found it was nearly 10. She thought about the morning. She had a call at 8. She had a call at 8 on Christmas Day, which was something she'd agreed to in September and had regretted in increasing increments since. And then she'd planned to spend the afternoon working through a prospectus she'd been putting off. She thought about none of those things with any particular urgency. "Can I tell you something?" Owen said. He was looking at the table again, which she was learning was what he did when he wasn't sure he should say what he was about to say. "Yes. I almost didn't come tonight, not because of Ethan. Before Ethan, I almost called this morning and said I wasn't ready." He looked up. I don't really do this. I've been on a handful of dates in the last few years, and they were all, I don't know, they were fine. But they felt like something I was supposed to be doing, not something I actually wanted." "What changed your mind?" He thought about it. "I don't know, honestly. Rachel said something about you that made me think you'd understand that this was hard for me without making it a whole thing." He paused. She was right. Vivian felt something in her chest do a complicated thing. "She said something about you too," she said. "What did she say?" "She said you were smart in the way where you'd been 10 minutes into a conversation before I realized I was leaning forward." He looked at her. "Are you?" She was, she realized. She was literally leaning forward, her arms on the table, and she hadn't noticed until this moment. "Apparently," she said. Something passed between them. Not the charged, cinematic kind of thing, not heat exactly, but the quiet, specific warmth of two people who have surprised each other and are both aware of it. Owen looked down at the table with a faint, private smile, and Vivian looked at the window where the snow was still coming down, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and it wasn't uncomfortable. He walked her out just before 10:30. The street was almost empty. The snow had done what Christmas Eve snow does in cities. Softened everything, slowed everything, turned the ordinary commercial block into something almost quiet. Their breath fogged the air. Vivian's coat was not warm enough for this, which she hadn't thought about when she'd gotten dressed, and she had her hands in her pockets. "I parked 2 blocks up," Owen said. "I'll get a car," Vivian said. They stood on the sidewalk outside the café, the kind of moment where the shape of the evening has to resolve itself one way or another. "I'd like to do this again," Owen said. "Direct. Not hedged. Not a blind date thing, just dinner. Intentionally." "Yes," Vivian said. She didn't manufacture uncertainty or make him wait. "I'd like that." He nodded. "Good." And then, "Thank you for staying." "You drove across the city on Christmas Eve because you thought my time had value," she said. "The least I could do was still be there." Something in his expression, something she couldn't fully name, but that looked like being seen, shifted before he controlled it. "Tell Ethan about the cat," Vivian said. "Captain Butterscotch deserves a name." Owen laughed. "I'm going to pretend you didn't say that, so I have a principled objection in the morning." "You're going to lose the principled objection." "Almost certainly." He raised one hand in a small wave, and she returned it, and he turned and walked up the block through the snow. She stood there for a moment after he disappeared around the corner. The city was quiet and cold, and she could see her own breath. She didn't know what this was. She didn't know what it was going to be. She understood, in the clear-eyed way she applied to almost everything, that she had just spent 3 hours with a man she barely knew, and that 3 hours was not a basis for anything except more time. But she'd been surprised, and she hadn't been surprised in a long time. She pulled out her phone to call a car, and as she waited for it, she turned back toward the cafe window and the warm light inside, and the loose edge of the memory she'd been circling all evening came a little closer. A winter storm. 7 years ago. The way a stranger's hands had been very sure and very calm, in a moment when nothing else was. She let it go. It was late, and she was tired, and it was probably nothing. Her car arrived, and she got in, and the city slid past the window, white and quiet, and Vivian Hale, who never wasted time, who made billion-dollar decisions without hesitation, who had put on a dress she didn't remember buying and sat alone in a cafe for almost an hour, looked out at the snow and found, to her considerable surprise, that she was not thinking about the work she'd left undone. She was thinking about a man who'd driven through a blizzard because canceling by text felt wrong, and a cat named Captain Butterscotch who was probably, at this exact moment, being given a better scarf than any cat had ever had. The call was at 8, and Vivian was on it by 7:59, which was not the same as being ready for it. She was standing in her kitchen in the clothes she'd slept in, which was not a habit. She didn't have a habit of sleeping in clothes, but last night she'd sat down on the couch with a glass of water and a prospectus she'd been meaning to read. And the next thing she knew, it was 6:43 a.m. and the prospectus was on the floor. And she had her phone on speaker while she made coffee and tried to locate the version of herself that was competent and professional and did not spend Christmas morning slightly dazed because of a man she'd met 12 hours ago. The call was with a fund manager in London who apparently had no feelings about Christmas and wanted to discuss a potential infrastructure deal before the holiday week closed everything down. Vivian answered his questions on autopilot, which was fine because she knew the material cold, and the part of her brain that wasn't tracking yield projections was doing something else entirely. She was thinking about the way Owen had said, "I didn't know yet." The specific phrasing of it, not "I hope so," or maybe, or any of the other things a man might say when he was trying to be charming. Just the plain honesty of someone who didn't know yet and wasn't going to pretend he did. She ended the call at 8:42 and stood in her kitchen with her coffee and thought, "This is already a problem. Not a catastrophic one, just a small, persistent one, the kind where a person takes up more interior space than they should given the available evidence." Her phone buzzed. She expected Rachel. Rachel would be expecting a full debrief. Rachel had probably been awake since 7 hoping for the debrief. But the number on the screen was one she'd entered last night when they'd exchanged numbers on the sidewalk with the practicality of people making another plan. Merry Christmas. Ethan has informed me that Captain Butterscotch is now the name of the shed cat, and also we are getting a cat, and it will also be named Captain Butterscotch. I want it noted that I lost this argument at 7:15 a.m. Vivian read it twice. Then she sat down at her kitchen counter and typed back, "At least now you have a position on cats." A pause. Then she added, "Merry Christmas." His response came quickly. He also wants to know if your middle name is something good. His current working theory is that everyone with a serious job has a boring outside name and a secret middle name. His is Danger. His middle name is Danger? His middle name is David. He has rebranded. Vivian, alone in her kitchen on Christmas morning, laughed out loud at her phone. It was not a dignified moment. She was fine with that. She put the phone down and looked at the window. Snow still on the ground, the city quieter than it would ever be again until next year. She thought about a man at a kitchen table somewhere across the city, managing an 8-year-old who had named himself Danger and was negotiating the terms of a cat adoption, and she thought, I want to know how this turns out. Not the romance of it, just the ordinary continuing fact of it. How Ethan's school thing resolved. Whether the cat materialized. What Owen Cross looked like on a Tuesday in February when nothing particular was happening. That was the part that got her, she decided. Not the flash of attraction, which she could handle, which she'd handled before, but the wanting to know what came next. They had dinner the following Thursday. Not Linden and Frost. A different place. A Thai restaurant on the east side that Owen had mentioned once, and Vivian had quietly looked up. Small, noisy, excellent food. The kind of place where the tables were too close together and you had to lean in to hear each other, which turned out to be fine. Better than fine. He told her about a problem he was troubleshooting in one of the office towers. A persistent pressure issue in the HVAC system that 3 contractors had looked at and none had solved. The way he described it was the same way she'd noticed on Christmas Eve. Not a story about himself, but about the problem. The pleasure was in the puzzle. What do you think is wrong? She asked. Duct lining in the northeast corridor is probably compromised. Someone patched it 3 years ago. I found the work order. And I think the patch failed and now the pressure is bleeding. But to confirm it, I need to get into a section of the ceiling that the building manager doesn't want opened because of renovation timing. Can you make the case for it? I can make the case. Whether anyone listens is a different thing. Vivian understood this with her whole body. Put the cost of delay in writing, she said. Estimated repair cost now versus estimated repair cost if the problem expands. Give him the number. Owen looked at her. You deal with this in your world too. Everyone deals with this. People don't respond to the problem. They respond to the cost of not solving the problem. She picked up her chopsticks. I learned that at 27, and it changed everything. What happened at 27? I had a client who was resistant to restructuring a position that I could see was going to cost him significantly. I gave him every rational argument. He didn't move. Then I put together one page that showed him month by month what staying in that position was going to cost him over the next year. He restructured within the week. Because it was real to him. Because it was specific to him. She paused. There's a difference. Real is abstract. Specific is his money, his timeline, his outcome. Owen was quiet for a moment, looking at the table with the particular expression she was learning to recognize. Not discomfort, but something more like absorption, taking something in and filing it. You're good at this, he said. My job? Thinking. The way you move from one thing to the next. He looked up. It's not a compliment that sounds impressive, I know, but I mean it specifically. She felt the warmth of it land in exactly the way he'd probably intended. Not a performance, just an observation. Thank you, she said, and meant it simply. They split a second order of the curry. He told her about Ethan's holiday week, the continued campaign for the cat, a complicated falling out with a friend from school over the terms of a Lego trade, the way he'd woken up 3 mornings in a row, having apparently conducted long negotiations in his sleep, based on the words he'd been saying when Owen came in to wake him. He talks in his sleep? He narrates in his sleep, full sentences. Last week he was explaining the aerodynamics of something to someone. Owen shook his head. I stood in the doorway for about 2 minutes listening to him explain why the wingspan mattered. What was he designing? I have no idea. I didn't want to wake him. It seemed important. She was doing it again, leaning forward. She'd started noticing it as a physical tell, her body's response to him. When he talked about Ethan, specifically, there was something that happened in her chest that she didn't fully have language for. It wasn't maternal, exactly. It was more like the specific pleasure of watching someone love something well. She'd been loved competently. She'd been loved enthusiastically, at least at the beginning. She didn't think she'd spent much time around someone who loved something the way Owen loved his son, not as an extension of himself, not as a project, but as its own complete person. He was trying very hard not to break. Over the next few weeks, they fell into something that wasn't quite a pattern, but had the shape of one. Dinner when schedules aligned. Texts in the odd spaces of the day. Nothing sustained, nothing that required real attention, just the small passing of information that meant someone was thinking about you. She sent him an article about HVAC pressure systems. He sent her a photo of a paint swatch Ethan had selected for what he was calling his creative studio, which was the corner of his room beside the window. The swatch was labeled Midnight Teal and was, in Owen's words, ambitious. She did not meet Ethan. Not yet. Owen was careful about that in a way she recognized as deliberate, not withholding, but protective in the right direction, toward the child rather than away from her. She respected it. She also found, in ways she examined honestly, that she was nervous about it, which was new. She was not typically nervous. What she was nervous about precisely, she couldn't fully articulate. Something about the stakes of a child's approval being different in kind from anything else. Something about the way Ethan existed in Owen's world as the most real thing in it, and being found wanting by the most real thing felt like a particular kind of loss. She didn't say this to Owen. She wasn't sure she was ready to say it. It was a Saturday in mid-January when the memory finally surfaced completely. She was in the office, not unusual, she worked most Saturdays, and she was going through files from a period 7 years back, looking for documentation related to a fund she was restructuring. Old files, scanned from paper originals, the kind of work that required no particular thought and left the mind free to wander. She found the insurance claim first, then the police report, then the hospital discharge summary, which she'd kept for reasons she no longer remembered, maybe just because the incident had felt significant enough to document, even after the fact. 7 years ago, late February, she'd been driving back from a site visit 2 hours outside the city, late afternoon, weather that had been rated fine when she left and had become something else entirely by the time she was an hour out, The kind of winter storm that arrives faster than the forecast predicted, that turns a manageable drive into something you should have pulled over for 20 minutes earlier. She'd hit the guardrail on a curve. The car had spun and come to rest at a bad angle against the embankment, driver's side down. She'd been unhurt, mostly. A cut on her forehead, bruised ribs, the particular physical shock of impact that takes a few hours to fully arrive. But the door was wedged against the embankment, and the passenger side was up, and she hadn't been able to get out, and her phone had gone into the footwell and she couldn't reach it, and it had been getting dark. A truck had stopped. She'd heard it before she saw it. The engine cutting, door slamming, boots on the road surface. Then a face at the passenger window. A man, not young but not old, calm in the particular way that people are calm when they're deciding what to do rather than panicking. He talked to her. She remembered his voice before she remembered anything else about him, steady and practical, not soothing in a hollow way, but genuinely measured. He'd gotten the passenger door open, helped her out, called 911 and stayed on with the dispatcher while she sat on the guardrail in the cold with his jacket around her shoulders, because he'd put his jacket on her before she'd thought to protest, and she'd been shaking too hard to give it back. The ambulance had taken 20 minutes. When it arrived and the paramedics were with her, she'd looked around and the truck was gone. She'd asked the paramedic if he'd seen the man, and he'd said there'd been no other vehicle when they arrived. She'd filed the police report, attempted, through the insurance company, to get contact information for the person who'd called 911, hit bureaucratic walls, eventually stopped trying because she'd been busy and unhurt, and the world kept moving. She sat in her office on a January Saturday and looked at the discharge paperwork, and thought about a man who described knowing buildings the way he knew his own apartment. A man who'd been in project management, construction adjacent, who would have driven that route, who would have been the kind of person who stopped. She picked up her phone, set it down, picked it up again. The thing was, she could be wrong. It was 7 years ago and she'd been in shock and she had impressions rather than facts. A height, a voice, hands that knew what they were doing. The memory was real, but the specifics were soft. And the alternative, being right, was something she needed to think about before she did anything with it. She was right. She didn't know it with certainty until the third week of January, a Sunday afternoon, when Owen mentioned almost in passing that he used to do a lot of driving for work in the years before Claire died. Site visits, mostly. He'd covered a substantial radius, 2 hours in any direction. "Did you ever stop for accidents?" she asked. Her voice was level. She was good at level. He looked at her with a slight frown. "What do you mean?" "On the road, if you came across someone who'd had an accident." "A few times, yeah." He set down his coffee cup. "Why?" "There was a storm," she said. "About 7 years ago, late February. A woman drove off the road on Route 9, about 90 minutes outside the city. Someone stopped. He got her out and called for help and left before the ambulance arrived." Owen was very still. "I was the woman," Vivian said. The cafe they were in was a different one this time, a smaller place near his apartment on their 4th or 5th outing, the geography already feeling familiar. Outside, it was gray and cold, the January sky with no particular quality to it. Owen was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not quite shock, more like the face of someone who has unexpectedly recognized themselves in a story they were being told. "Route 9, he said quietly. "Black sedan. Guardrail on the left side of the curve." She breathed out. "Yes." He looked at the table for a long moment, then, "You were okay. I mean, I knew you were okay when I left. The paramedic said I was fine, bruised ribs, minor concussion." She paused. "I spent about a year thinking about you. The insurance company couldn't get me your information. The 911 call was documented, but they wouldn't release contact details. I eventually just..." She lifted one hand slightly. "Stop trying. I didn't think..." He stopped. Started again. "I wasn't looking for recognition. You know that." "I know." She did know. It was one of the clearer things about him. "I'm not telling you because I feel like I owe you something. I'm telling you because I've known it for 2 weeks and it felt wrong not to." He was quiet. Not uncomfortable, just processing, that same internal absorption she'd come to recognize. You put your jacket on me, she said. I couldn't give it back before you left. I've thought about that jacket. He almost smiled. It was a good jacket. Dark green, wool blend. I still have it. She looked at him. Something moved through her that wasn't romantic in a simple sense. It was older than that, more weighted. The specific strangeness of sitting across from someone who existed in your past before they existed in your present. How come you remember it? He asked. Because I was sitting on a guardrail in the cold, and it was warm, and it smelled like motor oil and sawdust, which I found at the time extremely grounding. She paused. I was in shock. Small things registered. Owen nodded slowly. He was looking at her face carefully, not reading it for effect, but with the quality of someone trying to understand something real. I'm glad you were okay, he said finally. It was simple enough that it didn't sound like anything except exactly what it was. I know, she said again. They sat with it for a while. The cafe noise went on around them. The machine, other people's conversations, someone's phone. Regular Saturday sounds. Does it change something? Owen asked. For you, the way you think about this. She considered the honest answer. It explained something I didn't understand about why I agreed to the blind date. Rachel saying you were good wasn't quite enough, rationally. But somewhere I think I don't know how to say this without it sounding like something it isn't. Try. I think I already trusted you before I had any reason to. She looked at the table. That's not an explanation, I know that. But it's true. He was quiet for a moment. When she looked up, he was watching her with an expression that was careful and honest and slightly undone. The look of a man who hadn't been reached in a while and was not entirely sure what to do about being reached now. I should tell you something, he said. Okay. I stopped because Claire told me to. He said it steadily. She was in the truck with me. She saw the car first and said, Owen, stop. I would have stopped anyway. I'd like to think I would have stopped anyway. But she saw it first. He paused. She was like that. She noticed things before I did. Vivian didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. She just let it exist between them, the fact of it, the way Owen had just handed her a piece of his wife. Not sadly, not as a wound, but as a real thing that had happened, a woman who'd been real, who'd said stop and had no idea what she was setting in motion. She sounds like someone I'd have liked, Vivian said finally. Owen looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, he said quietly. I think you would have. The sky outside had gone darker, the kind of afternoon that turned to evening without much announcement. Vivian wrapped her hands around her cup and let the warmth into her palms and thought, 7 years. A jacket that smelled like sawdust. A woman in a truck who noticed something before her husband did. The shape of things. The way causes and outcomes run underground for years and then surface somewhere you never expected. Was something she understood from her professional life as an abstract principle. She had not expected to feel it in her own chest like this, like a long line pulled taut. Owen paid for the coffee. She let him, for once, without negotiating. Outside on the sidewalk, they stood in the cold for a moment before going their separate ways. He had Ethan's school pickup. She had reading she'd been avoiding. So, Owen said. So? She said. I owe you a jacket. She laughed, unexpected. You don't. The logic tracks, though. Your logic does not track at all. He smiled. The real one, the one that changed his face. And she thought, there it is. The thing she'd been trying to name since Christmas Eve. Not just attraction, not just interest. The specific ease of someone whose company required nothing performed. She'd been performing at some level for years. In every room she walked into, she was Vivian Hale of Halcyon Group, which was a version of herself she'd built carefully and maintained well. Even with Rachel, even with people she genuinely liked, there was a layer. With Owen, and she was only now noticing this, which meant it had been true for a while, the layer kept forgetting to show up. She pulled her coat tighter and said she'd text him, and he nodded, and they separated at the corner. She walked half a block before she looked back. He was still standing there, not watching her, looking up at the sky. Then he looked down, shook his head slightly at something, some private thought, and turned toward the subway. Vivian faced forward and kept walking, and the city was cold and ordinary and unremarkable. And she thought about a man who'd stopped on a dark road 7 years ago because his wife noticed something before he did. She thought, I want to know what comes next. Not carefully, not with calculation, just cleanly and honestly, and more than she'd wanted to know what came next in a very long time. The meeting happened on a Saturday in early February, which was not planned. Or rather, it was planned the way things are planned when an 8-year-old is involved, which is to say it was planned, and then Ethan rearranged it without knowing he'd done so. Owen had mentioned earlier that week that he was taking Ethan to the public library on Saturday morning. A regular thing, apparently. First Saturday of the month, Ethan picked 2 books, Owen picked 1, they got hot chocolate from the cart outside if it was cold enough. Vivian had her own Saturday plans, the office, a fund review, lunch she'd probably forget to eat. She hadn't said any of this. They'd just been talking, the way they did now, in the easy, overlapping rhythm of 2 people who'd started checking in without making a formal decision to. Then Saturday morning came, and Owen texted at 9:47. HVAC issue at the Meridian building, going to be at least 2 hours. Ethan's fine, I just need to reschedule the library. She was already in the car. She'd been heading to the office. She'd changed direction before she'd fully decided to. She texted back, I can take him, if he's okay with it. I can take him to the library. The pause before his response was long enough that she had time to think. Too fast. Too much. You've miscalculated the distance. Then, I'm going to ask him. Give me a second. Another pause. Then, he wants to know if you know what a graphic novel is. I do. He says, okay then. Tick. The library was 20 minutes from Owen's apartment, which was how Vivian came to meet Ethan Cross in the lobby of a building while Owen was somewhere in the mechanical room of an office tower downtown with his hands in a wall. She'd been nervous since she parked the car. She didn't show it. She was very good at not showing things. But her heartbeat had that particular elevated quality of a situation she couldn't fully control, and she was aware of checking her appearance in the rearview mirror twice before getting out, which was not something she typically did. Ethan was standing in the lobby with a woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Mrs. Patton from next door. Mrs. Patton had the warm, slightly appraising look of a woman who'd heard about Vivian in enough detail to have formed opinions, and she handed Ethan over with a pat on his shoulder and a look at Vivian that said, I'm watching how this goes. Ethan was taller than she'd expected, dark hair like his father, the same considering quality in his eyes. He was wearing a jacket with a small dinosaur patch on the sleeve and carrying a backpack that appeared to be at approximately 95% capacity, though he was transporting it with the ease of someone for whom this was normal. You're Vivian, he said. I am, she said. You're Ethan. Dad says you're smart. He's very kind. He also said you work a lot. Ethan considered her. He says that like it's a compliment, but I think it might be a concern. Vivian looked at this child for a moment. You might be right, she said. Something in his face shifted. A recalibration. A small upgrading of her status. Okay, he said. Let's go. They walked the 2 blocks to the library. Ethan talked with the fluency of someone for whom silence was a problem to be solved rather than a state to be tolerated. He explained in sequential detail the plot of the book he was currently reading, which involved a scientist who discovered that pigeons were carrying encoded messages but couldn't figure out who was sending them or why. He explained that he had a theory about it, but he wasn't going to tell her yet because she hadn't read it and he didn't want to give it away. He explained that Captain Butterscotch, the actual cat, which had now materialized, a small orange creature currently living in their apartment with the cautious energy of someone on a trial probation period, had knocked a glass off the counter this morning at 6 a.m., and that was how they'd both woken up. Were you angry? Vivian asked. I was annoyed, Ethan said, with the careful distinction of someone who'd been taught to be precise about emotional vocabulary. But it was kind of funny, so mostly I was annoyed funny. He thought about it. Dad just stood in the kitchen with his eyes half open looking at the broken glass like he was trying to decide if it was real. That's a very accurate description of how your father processes things before 9 a.m. Ethan stopped walking and looked at her. You know about the 9 a.m. thing? He mentioned it. He resumed walking, apparently satisfied. He tells you stuff. We talk, yes. He doesn't talk to most people very much, like, not real talking. He said it without emphasis, just reporting. He's fine, he keeps things. He paused at the library steps. Mom used to say he was like a jar with a really tight lid. You had to run it under hot water first. Vivian stood at the bottom of the library steps and felt the specific care required by this moment. The boy who'd just handed her something precious without entirely knowing it. She didn't rush past it. She didn't make it something bigger than it was. She sounds like she knew him very well, Vivian said. Yeah. He started up the steps. Come on. The graphic novel section is on the second floor. Ethan navigated the library with the familiarity of someone who'd been coming here long enough to have preferences and opinions about its organization. He showed her, with mild indignation, that the graphic novel section had been rearranged since last month, and several titles were now in the wrong order. He selected 2 books with decisive efficiency, examined a third and put it back because he said the art style bothered him, which he explained in enough technical detail that Vivian suspected he'd absorbed this vocabulary from somewhere specific. Do you draw? She asked. I try. I'm not that good yet. He didn't say it sadly, just accurately. Dad can't draw at all. He draws people that look like potatoes. Really sincere potatoes, but still potatoes. Vivian bit down on a smile. Can I ask what you want to be? Ethan thought about this seriously, the way children do when they're not performing an answer for an adult. I don't know yet. I like how things work. Not like machines specifically, just how things connect. Like, why does one thing happen and then a different thing happens? And why is the second thing the one that happens instead of something else? She looked at him. That's a very specific way of thinking. Dad says it's how he thinks too. He pulled out the 2 selected books and examined the covers again, checking his own decision. He says when he was my age, he used to take things apart to see how they fit back together and then not be able to get them back together again. Does he still do that? Now he can get them back together. Ethan looked up. Are you good at how things connect? I try to be. It's a lot of my job. What does your job actually do? Dad explained it, but his explanation had too many words. I take money that people have saved and put it into things that will grow, like buildings or energy systems or infrastructure, so that the money becomes more money over time. Ethan processed this. Like a garden, but for money. Exactly like that. He nodded, apparently filing it. That makes more sense. He tucked the books under his arm and wandered toward the window at the end of the aisle, not with any particular purpose, just moving the way children move when they're still thinking. The library was quiet and warm. Saturday morning light through tall windows, the good specific smell of old paper and carpet, and the particular institutional heating of a public building. Vivian leaned against the shelving and watched Ethan look out the window at the street and thought, I understand now what Owen meant about the eyes. They were Claire's eyes. She'd never seen a photograph of Claire. She didn't know if it would be right to ask, but she understood what Owen meant. There was something in the particular quality of Ethan's attention, the way he looked at things, that felt inherited in a way that went past genetics into something harder to name. Can I ask you something? Ethan said, still facing the window. Yes. Do you like my dad because he's a good person or because he's also smart? He turned around. Because some people like him just because he's nice, and he is nice. But I think the smart part is the important part. Vivian considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Both, she said, but you're right that the smart part is important. Nice without smart is, she looked for the right word. It doesn't hold. Yeah, he looked satisfied. That's what I thought. What made you ask? He shrugged. I just wanted to know if you were paying attention. She looked at this child, this small, serious, unexpectedly perceptive child who was watching her with his mother's eyes and his father's internal quality of attention, and thought, he's been the most real thing in Owen's world for 8 years, and I have just been assessed. Was I? She asked. Paying attention? Yeah, Ethan said. You are. He moved back toward the stairs, trailing one hand along the shelving. Hot chocolate's outside if it's cold enough, he said. It's cold enough. Tell. Owen arrived at the library at noon looking like a man who'd spent 2 hours in a wall. There was a streak of something gray on his forearm, and his jacket was open despite the weather, and he had the particular satisfied, tired expression of someone who'd found what they were looking for, even if it cost them. Ethan was deep in one of his new books in the reading area on the ground floor. Vivian was beside him with a cup of tea from the cart outside, which she'd gotten because the hot chocolate had a line and she was patient. Owen stopped in the doorway and looked at the two of them. Vivian didn't notice him immediately. She was looking at whatever Ethan was pointing out on the page, and she saw, from across the room, Owen's face in an unguarded moment. The expression on it was complicated. Relief, and something quieter underneath that, something she didn't have the full vocabulary for, but recognized as meaningful. She looked up and found him watching her. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside her. He was close enough that she could feel the cold still coming off his jacket. "How is the wall?" she asked quietly. "It was exactly what I thought it was, which is annoying and also gratifying." He glanced at Ethan, who was absorbed. "How was he?" "He gave me a fairly comprehensive evaluation." Owen turned to look at her. "He evaluated you?" "He wanted to confirm I was paying attention." She kept her voice neutral. "I passed." He was quiet for a moment, then, "He doesn't give that to everyone." "I know." She did know. She understood the weight of it. He's good at reading people. He's 8. He's 8 and he's good at reading people. She paused. "He also told me that your drawings of people look like sincere potatoes." Owen put his hand over his face. "He's never going to let that go." "Probably not." She almost smiled. "I think it's affectionate." "It's deeply unaffectionate." But the side of his mouth was doing the thing it did when he was suppressing something, and he lowered his hand, and what was underneath it was the real version of his face, the one that wasn't maintaining anything. "Thank you," he said. "For today. I know it wasn't Owen." She said his name in the flat, direct way she said things when she wanted to cut through the politeness. "I wanted to." He looked at her. Let it land without deflecting it. Ethan looked up from his book. He examined his father. He examined Vivian. He looked back at his book with the expression of someone who has confirmed a working theory and doesn't need to say so out loud. 3 weeks later, Vivian got the call. It was a Tuesday morning, early, before 7, and the caller ID said Marcus Webb, which was not unusual in itself. Marcus was her director of finance, 20 years with the company, competent in the specific, reliable way that made him easy to overlook. He called occasionally. Not at 6:52 a.m. "I need to show you something," he said when she picked up. "Not by email, not by phone. Marcus, in person, today." There was a quality in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not panic. Marcus wasn't a man who panicked, but the specific tightness of someone who has found something they wished they hadn't. "It's about Derek Paulson, her CFO. 6 years at Halcyon, smooth and effective and well-regarded, the kind of man who made investors comfortable at events and knew exactly what to say in the moments that required the right thing to be said." She was in the office by 7:30. What Marcus showed her took 40 minutes to walk through. He'd been reconciling a batch of historical invoices, routine work, end of quarter, and he'd found a vendor name he didn't recognize attached to a service category that didn't make sense. He'd pulled the thread. Then he'd pulled another thread. Then he'd called his own accountant at home on a Sunday, which said something about his state of mind, and the accountant had confirmed what Marcus was seeing. A network of contractor invoices, ghost vendors, payments routed through 3 shell entities before landing somewhere that wasn't Halcyon's accounts. It had been running, as far as Marcus could tell, for approximately 4 years. The total, conservatively calculated, was somewhere north of $4 million. Vivian sat in her office after Marcus left and looked at the documents on her desk for a long time. Derek Paulson, who attended every board meeting, who had the combination to the company's safe, who had, in the last 6 months, been pushing hard for a particular infrastructure deal that Vivian had been hesitant on, pushing it with a specific focused urgency that she'd attributed to professional enthusiasm. She opened her laptop, started pulling her own files, looked for the deal, found the entity Derek had been recommending they partner with, found a registration number, found the registered agent, found a name that appeared in the shell entity structure Marcus had traced. She sat back in her chair. The cold, clean feeling she got when the shape of a thing became completely clear had settled in her chest. This was not a theory. This was a structure. Someone had built it carefully, over 4 years, and it had worked because they were trusted and because the invoices were just small enough in isolation not to trigger automatic review. The deal Derek had been pushing, if it had gone through, it would have given him direct control over a substantial capital flow. The fraud would have scaled. The exposure would have been catastrophic. She needed a lawyer. She needed a forensic accountant. She needed to do this carefully and completely before she touched anything Derek could see. She also, and this thought arrived with the particular quality of something important rather than something incidental, needed someone who knew buildings, who knew contractor systems, who could look at a fabricated work order and tell her in 5 minutes whether the numbers and the specs were plausible or invented. She called Owen at 8:23. "I need a favor," she said when he answered. "A work thing. I need someone who understands contractor documentation. Real contractor documentation, not what it looks like in a spreadsheet." A pause. "What happened?" "I think my CFO has been stealing from the company for 4 years." She said it flat, because flat was how she could say it without the anger bleeding through. "I think I know how. I need someone to confirm that the technical elements of the scheme could actually work the way I think they worked." Owen was quiet for a moment. "Send me what you have." "This could be complicated for you. If it becomes a legal situation, send me what you have, Vivian." She did. He called her back in an hour and 20 minutes. "The HVAC invoices are fiction," he said immediately. "Whoever built these doesn't know maintenance work. The labor hours are wrong for the job size. This is a $40,000 invoice for HVAC work that should have cost 11, maybe 12. The equipment line items are real products, but they're not configured correctly for the building specs listed. And this contractor license number..." He paused. "I can't verify it directly, but the format is wrong for this state. It's got 1 digit too many." Vivian was taking notes. Her hand was steady. "Could you testify to this? If it came to that?" "I can document exactly what I'm seeing and explain why it demonstrates fabrication to anyone who asks." No hesitation. "Yeah, I can do that." She wrote something, stopped. "Owen, don't." His voice was quiet and firm. "Don't thank me. Just tell me when you have the full picture. And be careful with who you talk to before you're ready to move." She heard something in his voice underneath the practicality. Concern, the specific worried kind that wasn't about the fraud. And she understood that he was not thinking about the money. He was thinking about her. "I'll be careful," she said. After she hung up, she sat for a long moment with the phone in her hand. 4 years. Derek Paulson had been sitting in her company for 4 years, building this quietly, and she hadn't seen it. She was good. She was very good at what she did. And she hadn't seen it. That was going to live with her for a while. Not the fraud itself, but the gap. The space between what she believed she knew and what was actually true. She thought about Owen saying, "I'm good at seeing how things are actually connected, as opposed to how they're supposed to be connected." She thought about Ethan saying he keeps things. She pulled Marcus's documents back across the desk and picked up her pen, and the cold clarity was still there, and she worked. She didn't know, in those first days of pulling threads and building the file, that the problem was about to stop being only hers to solve. She didn't know, because she had no reason to know, that the Saturday before she'd called Marcus, well, the day Ethan was in the library and Owen was in a wall and the hot chocolate cart was outside and it was cold enough. Ethan had been somewhere else first. Ethan had spent the previous Friday afternoon at a school project meeting in the building where his friend Dominic's father worked. Owen had dropped him there at 3:30, before the HVAC call came in. Dominic's father was a property manager, a man who occupied the building as background, someone Ethan had met twice and thought of, if at all, as the man with the good vending machine code. The meeting had let out early. Dominic's father was in a meeting of his own, so Ethan and Dominic had waited in the break room. The break room shared a wall with the small conference space next to it, and the wall, as Ethan had correctly identified, was not very thick. He didn't understand most of what he heard. He understood a name, Paulson. He understood the phrase, "if she traces the Meridian vendors," which he filed because Meridian was the building his dad had spent Tuesday in. He understood the word liability in a way that wasn't about insurance, and the phrase "get rid of it before the quarter closes," and a second name he didn't recognize but would remember because it was unusual, Strauss. And he understood, with the particular accuracy of a child who has learned to pay attention, because paying attention was how you navigated a world where the adults around you were often figuring things out as they went, that the two men in the next room were not talking about something good. He didn't say anything to Dominic. He didn't say anything to Mrs. Patton. He went home and had dinner and did his homework and watched 20 minutes of television and went to bed, and the information sat in him the way information sits in children. Not forgotten, just waiting for the moment it became relevant to something. That moment arrived sooner than any of them were prepared for, Ethan told his father on a Wednesday. Not because he'd been holding it strategically. He wasn't built that way, whatever his capacity for observation, but because the information hadn't felt urgent until it did. He'd been sitting with it the way he sat with most things, turning it over, waiting to understand what shape it was before deciding what to do with it. And then Owen mentioned Vivian at dinner Wednesday evening, something ordinary, just that she was dealing with a hard work situation. And Ethan put his fork down and said, "Is it about someone named Paulson?" Owen looked at his son across the kitchen table. "Where did you hear that name?" The story came out in pieces, the way Ethan told things, not in order, but with all the important parts. And Owen had learned years ago not to rush the sequencing because the sequencing was how Ethan organized his thinking out loud. By the time it was assembled, Owen was very still in the way that meant he was not calm, but was choosing to appear calm for the purposes of not alarming the child across the table. "And the other name," Owen said carefully, "the one you said was unusual." "Strauss." Ethan picked his fork back up. "I remembered it because it sounds like the word for when something is stressed but with extra letters." "Did you see either of those men?" "No, just heard them through the wall." He ate a bite of his pasta. "Was it bad, what they were saying?" Owen looked at his son, this careful, attentive, observant kid who had sat in a break room and filed information with the quiet patience of someone who understood, on some level, that the world had things in it that weren't what they appeared to be. "I don't know yet," Owen said, "but I need to call Vivian. Is she going to be okay?" "Yes," Owen said, which was the answer he had to give regardless of certainty, and also, he found, the answer he believed. "Yeah, she's going to be fine." He called her from the hallway while Ethan finished dinner, keeping his voice low and his back to the kitchen doorway. She picked up on the second ring. He told her what Ethan had heard, in order, including the name Strauss. The silence on her end lasted approximately 4 seconds, which was long enough for Owen to understand that the name meant something. "Nathan Strauss," she said. "Not a question." "You know him." "He's on my board." Her voice had the flat, careful quality of someone controlling a reaction. "He's been pushing Derek's deal harder than Derek has." A pause. "He's on the audit subcommittee." Owen leaned against the wall, which means he'd have visibility into everything Marcus found, everything I've been building. She was quiet for a moment. "If Strauss knows I'm looking," "They know," Owen said. "That's what Ethan heard. If she traces the Meridian vendors, they already know you're looking." Another silence, longer. "How long ago was this?" she asked. "Friday. Last Friday." "That's 5 days." He could hear her thinking, not the sound of it, but the quality of the silence, the specific density of it. "They haven't moved yet," which means either they think I don't have enough, or they're waiting for something. "The quarter closes in 10 days, Owen said, because Ethan had said before the quarter closes, and Owen had a good memory for specifics. He heard her exhale, short, controlled. "They're going to try to destroy the records before the close. The original vendor files, the source documentation. If those disappear, what I have is circumstantial. A pause. I need to move before they do. What do you need? I need... She stopped, started again. I need to think. Give me an hour. Another pause, and then something shifted in her voice, away from the operational and toward the real. Ethan heard all of this and didn't panic. He had pasta for dinner and asked if you were going to be okay. She was quiet for a second. What did you tell him? I told him yes. Good, she said softly. That was the right answer. The hour turned into 3, and by the time Owen put Ethan to bed, the shape of the next 48 hours had begun to clarify. Vivian had called her attorney. The attorney had called a forensic accounting firm she'd worked with on a litigation matter 2 years prior. Between them, they'd identified what needed to be preserved and in what order, and they'd agreed that the board meeting, already scheduled for the following Friday as a routine quarterly session, was the right moment. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was controlled. All parties in one room, legal counsel available, a record being made. The risk was getting to Friday without Derek or Strauss understanding the full scope of what she had. Owen lay awake past midnight, which wasn't unusual. He was a light sleeper, had been since Ethan was born, the parental wiring that had never fully switched off. But the quality of the wakefulness was different. Not the low-level monitoring of a parent listening for a sick child, but something older and more complicated. He was thinking about Vivian in her office, which he'd never seen, working through documents he'd only partially understood. He was thinking about the fact that Derek Paulson had sat across from her at meetings for 6 years, and she'd trusted him with the actual architecture of her company, and that trust had been a tool someone used against her. He thought about what that did to a person. Not the money. The money was recoverable. She'd said so with a directness that suggested she'd already calculated it. But the other thing, the gap between what you believed you knew and what was true. The way that gap, once you found it, made you question the reliability of every other thing you thought you knew. He understood that in a way he hadn't had to explain to her, which was one of the things about Vivian that still caught him off guard. How often he didn't have to explain things. He'd gotten used over the years to being the person who understood things other people didn't want to take time with. It was useful, but it was also lonely. The specific loneliness of competence that goes unmatched. With Vivian, the understanding ran the other direction too. She saw what he was doing before he did it. She caught the thing underneath the thing he said. He hadn't realized how much energy he'd been spending maintaining the versions of himself that different situations required until he was with someone who seemed to see through all of them without making it a confrontation. He understood, somewhere past the point where this was just interesting. He rolled over in the dark and thought, Ethan likes her. Ethan, who had the emotional instincts of someone twice his age and the candor of someone half of it. Ethan, who had evaluated her in the library with the seriousness of someone making a real decision. He fell asleep eventually and dreamed nothing he remembered. Thursday passed in a particular kind of tension, the tension of waiting for something to happen, watching for the sign that the other side had moved. Vivian worked from her office and sent Owen updates in short texts, practical and clipped, the way she communicated when she was running on the operational part of herself with the rest carefully managed. Attorney confirmed. Documentation chain is solid. Forensic accountant identified 2 additional shell entities, total closer to 4.8 million. Strauss missed this morning's check-in call. First time in 2 years. That last one arrived at noon, and Owen read it and felt the particular cold attention of a situation accelerating. He was at the Meridian building, as it happened. The follow-up visit to document his earlier findings. The legitimate paperwork version of the same wall he'd been in on Saturday. He stood in the mechanical room reading her text and thought, Strauss missed the call because he's deciding something. He texted back, "What does your attorney say?" Her response, "That we move tonight if we have to. File for emergency preservation of records. Forces their hand before they can destroy anything." Then, "I'm going to need you to send me your formal documentation on the contractor invoices, signed, dated, with your professional credentials attached." He sent it within the hour. 3 pages, clear and specific, with the license number discrepancy and the labor hour analysis and the equipment configuration problems, Each one explained in the plain language of someone who knew what he was talking about and wasn't trying to impress anyone. She called him at 4. "It's good," she said immediately. "It's very good. My attorney says this is the clearest technical debunking of fraudulent contractor documentation she's seen outside of a formal forensic context. It's just what I saw. That's what makes it good." A pause. "Owen, I have to tell you something." "Oh, so?" Her voice shifted, not dramatically, just a fraction, the way it shifted when she was going to say something she'd been holding. "Strauss called Marcus this afternoon. He said he'd heard there were concerns about some historical invoices and wanted to schedule a call with Marcus and Derek together to get ahead of any misunderstanding. He's trying to get a read on how much you have." "Yes, and he's trying to get Marcus on record saying something before I can brief Marcus on what not to say." She paused. "Marcus called me immediately. He didn't take the meeting. Good man. He's been with me for 20 years. Something in her voice. Not quite emotion, but the edge of it, the place where professional commitment and genuine feeling were the same thing. I've taken him for granted. That's something I'm going to fix." Owen leaned against the cold concrete wall of the Meridian mechanical room. Outside the narrow window, the city was gray and winter dark at 4 in the afternoon. "Are you scared?" he asked. A pause. "No." Then, "Yes. A little." Another pause. "I'm angry. Mostly I'm angry, and the scared part is underneath the angry part, and I'm trying to not let the angry part make decisions." That's a solid approach. "You say that like it's easy." "I say it like it's the right call. Easy has nothing to do with it." She was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her in the silence. Not distressed, but real. The version of herself she didn't present in rooms. "I need you to be somewhere tomorrow," she said. "The board meeting. I need you there, not in the room. You can't be in the room, but nearby. My attorney will have the documentation, but you're the one who can explain the technical elements to someone who isn't following the accounting." "I'll be there," he said without hesitating. "Owen," I said, "I'll be there. Firm. Not negotiable." "What time?" The morning of the board meeting arrived with the specific texture of days that are going to matter. Nothing cinematic about it, just the ordinary difficulty of a day that requires you to be more than you feel like being at 7 a.m. Vivian was at the office by 6:30. Her attorney, Sandra Cho, was already there, along with the forensic accountant and a second attorney Sandra had brought for additional coverage. They spent an hour going through the presentation order, the documentation sequence, the moment at which the authorities, already briefed and standing by, would be called in. Vivian had not slept well. She hadn't told anyone this. She'd lain in her apartment from 11 to 3 doing the things she did when she was nervous about something real, which was to work the problem until it was resolved, or until she ran out of runway, and she'd run out of runway somewhere around 2:30, and had spent the subsequent hour and a half staring at the ceiling being angry about Derek Paulson in a way that wasn't useful, but felt necessary. Owen arrived at 8:15 and waited in the small conference room down the hall from the main boardroom, the one with the frosted glass door, with the documentation on the table in front of him and a coffee he'd gotten from the cart outside. He didn't text her. He just waited, in the steady, reliable way he had of occupying a space. She passed the conference room on her way to the boardroom and stopped at the door for a moment. He looked up. "You're good," he said. "Not you'll be fine, or don't worry. Just, you're good." The statement of a fact. She nodded once and went to the boardroom. The board meeting opened at 9 with 7 board members present, plus Derek Paulson as CFO, plus Sandra Cho representing Vivian in a capacity Derek visibly registered with a flicker of something he controlled quickly. Nathan Strauss was there in his usual seat to the left of the head of the table, his face carrying the particular smooth composure of a man who had prepared for this and believed his preparation was sufficient. Vivian ran the opening 15 minutes normally. Routine items, quarterly review, the surface of a regular meeting, because she needed everyone settled before the surface changed. Then she said, "I'd like to move to an unscheduled item." She watched Derek's hands on the table. She watched Strauss's face. "Over the past 3 weeks," she said, I've been working with external counsel and forensic accounting to investigate a series of anomalies in our contractor invoice history going back approximately 4 years. Derek said, "Vivian, I'd like to finish, Derek." Her voice was completely level. The investigation has identified a network of 6 shell vendor entities receiving payments across 14 different projects, totaling approximately $4.8 million in funds that were not applied to any documented work product. She placed the summary document in front of each board member. The technical documentation, including analysis of fraudulent contractor licensing numbers and implausible labor specifications, has been prepared by a certified maintenance professional with 17 years of field experience and is included as Exhibit C. She looked at Strauss. We also have records of communication indicating that at least one board member had knowledge of this scheme and took steps to interfere with the investigation. The room was, for approximately 2 seconds, completely silent. Derek spoke first. These are accounting discrepancies that have an explanation. There's been a misunderstanding about how the vendor structure. Derek! Sandra Cho set a separate document on the table in front of him. I'd recommend you stop talking and call your attorney. This is an ambush, Strauss said. His composure had cracked at one edge. Not collapsed, but showing the strain. You've compiled a set of unverified allegations based on. The allegations are verified, Vivian said. By a forensic accountant, by legal counsel, and by a technical expert whose documentation demonstrates that the work orders attached to these invoices describe configurations physically impossible in the buildings listed. She paused. I also have a record of a phone call you made to my director of finance on Thursday in which you attempted to preemptively shape his account of the discrepancies. That call was logged, and Marcus Webb provided a written statement regarding its contents this morning. Strauss looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated, the recalculation of a man who'd built his confidence on incomplete information about how much she had. She had more than he'd thought. That was clear from his face. She'd built the file more completely and more quickly than he'd expected. I'd like to call a short recess, said the board chairman, a man named Gerald Park, who had spent the last 8 minutes reading the summary document with increasing alertness. Before we do, Vivian said, I want to note for the record that the appropriate authorities have been briefed and are available. I'd prefer to handle this through proper channels in an orderly way. Whether that's possible depends on the cooperation of the parties concerned. She looked at Derek. She looked at Strauss. She kept her face neutral, the way she kept her face neutral in hard negotiations. The particular expression that said, I am not angry, I am simply in possession of all the relevant information, and we are both aware of that now. The recess was called. Sandra moved immediately to Derek's end of the table. Owen's documentation was referenced 4 separate times in the next hour, each time by Gerald Park, who had the careful focus of a man who wanted to understand the technical elements correctly before he said anything that could be quoted. Owen, in the conference room down the hall, was told by Sandra's paralegal what was happening in real time. He sat with his coffee going cold and said very little because there was nothing he needed to say. The work was done. What remained was the structure asserting itself. Derek Paulson did not confess in the boardroom. That wasn't how these things went. What he did was go very quiet and call his attorney on a recess break, and the attorney arrived within 40 minutes, and the negotiation that followed was between lawyers in a separate room while the board meeting technically remained in recess. Nathan Strauss left the building at 11:15. He was met in the lobby by 2 people from the Financial Crimes Division who had been briefed by Vivian's attorney the previous day and had been waiting with the patience of people who had done this before. Vivian was told about this from the doorway of the boardroom by Sandra, who said it with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd also had a long week. She stood at the head of the conference table. Everyone else had stepped out for the recess. It was just her in the room for a moment, and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. 4 years, 4.8 million. A man she'd trusted. She was not going to cry about it in the boardroom, and she didn't. But she let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly 60 seconds. The anger, and underneath it the genuine grief of a betrayal, which was what it was, regardless of the professional framing. And then she straightened up and pulled her jacket flat and walked out into the hallway. Owen was there. He'd left the conference room when Sandra's paralegal told him it was over. Not controlled, just moved toward where she was, the instinct of someone who knew where they needed to be. He was standing in the hall outside the boardroom with his jacket in his hand, and that particular expression she recognized as him, not performing anything. She walked to him and he opened his arms and she put her face against his shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. He smelled like coffee and cold air and the faint specific warmth of his jacket, and she thought, with the strange clarity of an exhausted person, this is the jacket. It wasn't the same jacket, but it was the same person. "It's done," he said quietly. "It's done," she said. His arms tightened slightly. Then, "Ethan wants to know if you're okay. He texted me 6 minutes ago. He's been at school all morning trying not to think about it, apparently." She laughed. Short and unexpected, the real version, with no decoration. "Tell him I'm okay. Tell him yourself." He pulled back slightly, reached into his pocket, held out his phone with the open message thread. She took it. Typed, "I'm okay. Your dad was here. It helped." The reply came back in under a minute. "Good." Captain Butterscotch was also worried, but she won't admit it. Vivian stood in the hallway outside the boardroom where she'd just exposed a 4-year fraud and held Owen's phone and felt something in her chest that had been wound tight for weeks simply release. Not everything. There was still the legal process, the board restructuring, the work of rebuilding what Derek had quietly corroded. There was still a lot of work. But the immediate thing. The thing she'd been carrying since that Tuesday morning when Marcus had called at 6:52. That was done. She handed Owen his phone back. He pocketed it. "Come on," he said. I'll buy you lunch. Not the cafe, somewhere with real food. I have a call at 1. Cancel it." She looked at him. "Vivian." He said her name in the specific flat way she used when she wanted to cut through something. She recognized it because she was the one who'd taught him, without intending to, by doing it first. "Cancel the call." She canceled the call. They walked out of the building into the cold February afternoon, and the city was doing its ordinary thing around them. Cabs, pedestrians, the specific noise of a midweek afternoon in a place where things were always happening whether you were paying attention or not. And Owen held the door, and she went through it, and the cold air hit her face like something clean. She didn't have language for what the last several weeks had been, or what they'd become to each other in the middle of it. She knew what she felt. She'd known for a while. But she was Vivian Hale, and she didn't say things until she knew what she meant by them, and she wasn't sure yet if she had the right words. What she had was this: a man walking beside her on a February afternoon, unhurried, taking up the right amount of space. A kid who'd texted from school to check if she was okay. A cat named after a condiment who would not admit to feelings. She thought, this is what I didn't know I was missing. She didn't say it. She tucked it away for later when she had the words for it, and she turned up her collar against the cold and kept walking. The legal process was not fast, and it was not clean, and anyone who told you otherwise had never been through one. Vivian understood this going in. She'd been involved in litigation before, on the periphery of deals that went sideways, and she knew that the distance between the evidence is clear and the matter is resolved was measured not in logic, but in months, in filings, in the particular grinding patience required to let a process run its course without trying to control it faster than it could move. She knew this, and had prepared herself for it, and still found, somewhere around the 3rd week of March, that she was eating lunch at her desk 4 days out of 5, and had canceled 2 social engagements and was sleeping less than she should. Owen noticed before she said anything. He noticed the way he noticed things, quietly, without announcement, through the accumulation of small details, the texts that came later in the evening than they used to, the way she'd answer a question, and then the conversation would move on and she'd circle back 10 minutes later to the question, as if she'd only half processed it the first time. The Tuesday night they'd had dinner, and she'd been 3/4 present, the other quarter somewhere in the documentation she wasn't supposed to be reviewing after 8 p.m. He didn't make it a conversation immediately. He waited, not passively, but with the specific patience of someone who understood that some things needed to arrive at their own moment. And then one evening in late March, sitting in his apartment after Ethan had gone to bed, Captain Butterscotch arranged on the couch between them with the territorial confidence of an animal who had fully colonized a household in 6 weeks. He said, "You're burning yourself down." Vivian looked up from her phone, which she'd been looking at without reading. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't fine. I said you're burning yourself down." He kept his voice level. No accusation in it, just the plain statement of what he was observing. "There's a difference. You can be fine and still be running at a temperature that's going to cost you." She set her phone on the cushion, looked at him for a moment. "The preliminary hearing is in 3 weeks. Derek's legal team filed a motion yesterday that my attorneys say is standard delay strategy, but it still requires a response, and the board is in a transitional state, and I have 2 senior staff who are, understandably, rattled about what it means for the company's reputation, and I have to manage that while also managing the process. And She stopped. "You're carrying all of it," he said. "It's mine to carry." "Most of it is. Not all of it." He looked at her steadily. "You're allowed to put some of it down when you're here." She was quiet. Captain Butterscotch shifted position and resettled with the self-important adjustment of a cat rearranging a throne. "I don't know how to do that," Vivian said. It cost her something to say it. She could see that in the way she said it, the deliberate flatness that was the sound of her being honest without dress rehearsing the honesty. "I've been carrying things by myself for a long time. The mechanism for not doing that isn't... I haven't used it in a while. I'm not sure it works." "It works," Owen said. "You just have to let it." "You make that sound simple." "No, I really don't." He reached over and picked up her phone from the cushion and set it on the coffee table, face down, the way you'd move something out of someone's hands before they realized they were holding it. "I spent 2 years after Claire died not letting anyone help me with anything. I had a whole system of reasons why that was actually healthy and self-sufficient." He paused. "Ethan finally told me I was being dumb about it. He was 8 when Claire died. He was 5. He was 6. And yes, his exact words were, 'Dad, you're being dumb about this,' and then he went back to his cereal." Owen looked at the coffee table. He was right. Vivian looked at the side of his face, the particular stillness of him, the way he carried weight without showing the effort. She thought about a man in a truck on a dark road 7 years ago, who'd stopped because stopping was the right thing and not for any other reason. She thought about all the ways someone could be good that had nothing to do with the visible, promoted, rewarded versions of good. The ways it ran quiet and deep and got mistaken for ordinary. "I'm not good at needing things," she said. "I know." He turned to look at her. "You're getting better at it." She wasn't sure that was true, but she thought he might be right that she was trying, which was a different thing and possibly more important. She picked up her tea, gone cold, she'd forgotten about it, and sat back against the couch and let the evening be just an evening for once, without the part of her brain that was always already at the next problem pulling her forward. It wasn't effortless. It required something that was close to active work, the deliberate setting down of a thing she'd been holding so long she'd stopped noticing the weight. But she managed it, approximately. Captain Butterscotch climbed onto her lap with no preamble and settled there as if this had always been the arrangement. "She doesn't do that," Owen said. "She's doing it. She doesn't like anyone. She barely tolerates Ethan." "She has excellent taste," Vivian said, and Owen laughed, and the evening continued. The preliminary hearing came and went. Derek's motion was denied. The forensic evidence, including Owen's technical documentation, was entered into the formal record with a clarity that Sandra Cho described as unusually airtight, which Vivian understood to be a compliment of the highest order from a woman who did not dispense them loosely. Nathan Strauss, confronted with the phone call to Marcus and the timeline of his communications with Derek, reconstructed by the forensic accountants, reached a cooperation agreement with investigators in early April. His cooperation produced 3 additional years of documentation that Vivian hadn't had, reaching back to the scheme's origins, which predated her own tenure as CEO by 18 months, a fact that her attorney said mattered enormously, and that Vivian herself found, in a complicated way, both a relief and a new source of anger. It had started before her. It had grown in the gaps she hadn't thought to look in. Both things were true, and she had to hold them both. Marcus was given a formal commendation from the board, which he received with the slightly embarrassed dignity of a man who felt he'd just done his job. Vivian took him to dinner at a good restaurant and told him what she should have said years earlier, which was that he was the most reliable person in the organization, and she'd been wrong to take that reliability for granted. He accepted this with more grace than she deserved and told her about his plan to retire in 3 years and travel to Portugal, which he'd never mentioned before, and she realized she'd never asked. She started asking. The board underwent a structural review that Vivian ran with the focused energy of someone who has identified a systemic failure and intends to correct the system rather than patch the surface. New audit procedures, a rotation policy for the finance subcommittee, an external ethics review she commissioned voluntarily, which the board did not love, and she proceeded with anyway because the point was not to make the board comfortable. The point was to make the organization harder to compromise. It cost her political capital. 2 board members who'd been comfortable with the previous arrangement, not corrupt, just accustomed, made their displeasure known through the particular channel of suddenly having scheduling conflicts for calls. She let them be displeased. She'd learned in the process of the last several months that not everything that looked like opposition was worth engaging on its own terms. Some of it was just the friction of change, and the correct response to friction was to keep moving. She was different after it. She knew she was different, could feel it in the way she inhabited her work. Not shaken, not diminished, but stripped of a particular kind of confidence she hadn't known was hollow until it was tested. The certainty that her judgment was sound, that she knew the room she was in, that competence was sufficient armor. Competence was necessary. It wasn't sufficient. That was the thing she'd learned and was still learning, in the way that real lessons don't arrive once and stay put, but keep returning in different forms until they're actually integrated. What she was also learning, more slowly and with more resistance, was that the people who'd stood beside her through it, Marcus, Sandra Cho, and Owen, specifically Owen, had changed what the experience cost her. Not removed the cost, just changed it, made it something she'd survived with company rather than alone, and the difference between those two things was larger than she'd have predicted before she understood it from the inside. Ethan Cross received a commendation from his school's principal in May, which embarrassed him profoundly and which his father photographed with a pride he made no attempt to conceal. The commendation was for academic achievement, nothing to do with what he'd overheard in the break room, which had been kept from school entirely. But Vivian stood next to Owen at the small ceremony in the school gymnasium and watched Ethan accept a certificate with the expression of someone who would rather be anywhere else but was trying to be polite about it, and felt something she still didn't have a clean word for. It was not maternal exactly. She'd examined this before and arrived at the same conclusion. It was more specific than that. The particular attachment to a particular person, this kid with his considered opinions and his inherited attentiveness and his deeply uncomplicated approach to deciding whether someone was worth his time. He'd decided she was, in the library in February, with the seriousness of someone making a real assessment, and she understood now that she'd been aware of his verdict before she'd been fully aware that she wanted it. After the ceremony, Ethan stood beside her in the gymnasium while Owen talked to his teacher and said, "The certificate is dumb." "It's not dumb, it's recognition. It's a piece of paper they printed this morning. I could see the printer ink was still wet." "Ethan, I'm just saying." He held it at arm's length, examining it. "If I get one every year, it'll be less meaningful. That's not how recognition works." He looked at her sideways. "How does it work?" She thought about it. "It's less about the certificate and more about the fact that someone paid enough attention to notice." She paused. "That part matters even if the certificate is wet." He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was actually processing something rather than waiting to respond. "Dad said something like that once, about the maintenance work, that people don't see it unless something's broken." He's right. It bothers him sometimes. Ethan said it matter-of-factly, no particular weight to it. He doesn't say so, but I can tell. She looked at this boy, 8 years old and keeping the kinds of tabs on his father that his father kept on him, both of them quietly watching each other, the closed loop of two people who were each other's primary point of reference for years before anyone else was in the picture. "You're both very good at noticing things," she said. Ethan considered this. "Yeah," he said, with no false modesty. "We kind of are." Owen came back, and they went out for lunch, and Ethan ordered the same thing he always ordered and complained mildly about the certificate being rolled incorrectly and told them about a book he'd finished and asked Owen 3 times if they could stop by the pet store on the way home. Not to buy anything, just to look, a distinction he maintained with careful emphasis. And it was ordinary in a way that Vivian had stopped taking for granted. The particular ordinary of a Saturday afternoon with people you wanted to be with. She'd undervalued it for years. She was trying not to anymore. In June, Vivian restructured the Halcyon Group's community investment framework. It was something she'd been thinking about before the fraud, something she'd discussed in general terms with her board as a strategic direction. But the experience of the previous months had sharpened the thinking into something more specific and more urgent. The framework included 3 components. The first was a revised contractor partnership policy. More rigorous vetting, more transparent documentation requirements, with a preference for small and mid-sized firms with verifiable local track records. Marcus helped design the documentation standards, which were based in part on the same framework Owen had used to identify the fraudulent invoices. The irony was not lost on anyone, and Vivian didn't attempt to obscure it. She'd learned, in a hard and expensive way, what sound contractor documentation looked like and what it didn't, and she intended to use that knowledge productively. The second component was a scholarship fund. She named it for Claire Cross, which was a decision she made alone and then told Owen about over dinner in June, watching his face go very still in the way it went still when something reached him below the level of his prepared reactions. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She looked at him steadily. She stopped the truck. Everything that came after that, you being there that night, Ethan being the person he is, any of this, it starts with her noticing something before you did. She paused. "I wanted there to be something that had her name on it that was real, that kept going." Owen looked at the table. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was controlling something. "It's for kids in building trades programs," Vivian said, keeping her voice even because his wasn't entirely. "Technical education, apprenticeship support, that kind of thing. I thought—" She paused. "It felt like the right fit." He looked up. His eyes were clear, but the edges of them were not. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "It does." They didn't talk about it much more that evening. They didn't need to. There are things that don't need to be elaborated once they've been said, and this was one of them. It existed now, would keep existing, and the name on it would mean something to the people who knew what it meant. That was enough. The third component was Owen himself, though this took longer to work out. She'd been thinking about it since February, since she'd watched him explain fraudulent contractor documentation with the clarity of someone who understood not just the technical elements, but the system they existed within, the way he saw structural problems, the way he moved through the informal architecture of how things actually worked, as opposed to how they were supposed to work. She had buildings. She had infrastructure investments. She had, increasingly, a portfolio of community-adjacent projects that sat in the territory between pure investment return and genuine civic function, energy systems, transit-adjacent development, affordable commercial space. All of it required someone who could translate between the world of capital and the world of physical systems, someone who understood both well enough to see where they connected and where they didn't. She'd talked to Marcus about it. She'd talked to Sandra. She'd thought about it for longer than was probably necessary because she was aware that the personal and professional were no longer cleanly separated, and she wanted to be honest with herself about which was driving which. The honest answer was both. Both were driving it. She had a real need, and he was genuinely the right person for it. And also she wanted more of his time in her world, and she didn't think those things were in conflict, but she'd needed to sit with them long enough to be sure. She asked him on a Tuesday evening in early June. Not dramatically, at his kitchen table with coffee while Ethan was in the other room and Captain Butterscotch was distributing herself across the chair in the corner. "I want to bring you on in a formal capacity," she said. "Community development oversight for a portfolio of projects. It's not a finance role. It's exactly what you do, which is understand how built systems actually function and what they actually cost and what the difference is between what the paperwork says and what's true." She set a folder on the table. "I wrote a job description. You don't have to take it. I want to be clear about that." Owen looked at the folder, didn't open it yet. "This isn't you trying to fix something about my life," he said. It wasn't an accusation. He said it the way he said most things, as a question being checked. "No," she was direct. "This is me having a genuine business need and you being the right person for it. The fact that I also—" She paused. "The fact that it means you're more in my world is a separate thing that I'm also in favor of, but it's not why I'm offering this." "You could have led with the second part. I wanted to lead with the legitimate part." "They're both legitimate, Vivian." He said her name in the specific way he said it sometimes, with a weight that wasn't quite heavy, just real. "Wanting someone in your life is legitimate." She looked at him. "I know. I'm still learning to treat it that way." He opened the folder. She watched him read. He read carefully and in order. She'd noticed this about him, the way he processed written information, moving through it sequentially without skipping ahead. And she drank her coffee and waited, which was something she was also still learning. "The travel component," he said finally. "Site visits. Flexible scheduling. I know you have. The priority is always Ethan's calendar. We work around it. I'd need to build in school year constraints." Already in the description, page 2, second paragraph. He turned to page 2. Read. He turned back to page 1 and read something again. "This is a real job. It's a real job. You're not creating a position to give me something." "Owen," she set her cup down. "I have 2 projects in pre-development right now that are stalled because I don't have someone who can sit in a room with a contractor and a structural engineer and an investment analyst and make sure all 3 are talking about the same building. I've been trying to hire for that gap for 8 months. You can do that." She paused. "I've watched you do it." He was quiet, looking at the folder. "Ethan's going to say I should take it," he said, mostly to himself. He would be correct. He's going to be insufferable about it. "Almost certainly." Owen looked up. The expression on his face was the one she'd seen in the library in February, when she'd walked in with Ethan and he'd found them at the reading table. That complicated thing. Relief and something quieter underneath it. Something he didn't always have a word for either. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you'll take it? Or okay, you'll think about it?" "Okay, I'll take it." He closed the folder. "When do I start?" "We'll figure out the official date." She picked up her cup. "There's paperwork." "There's always paperwork." "Yes." She almost smiled. "But this time the paperwork is correct. I had Marcus check." He laughed, and in the other room Ethan called out from whatever he was doing, "Dad, Captain Butterscotch knocked something over. It was probably my fault." And Owen got up to deal with it. And Vivian sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and the sense, clear and undecorated, of a life that had made room for her without asking her to be smaller to fit in it. Summer arrived in the specific way it arrived in the city. Suddenly, all at once, the temperature shifting from March's extended gray into something warm and bright with the abruptness of a decision made. Ethan finished 3rd grade and was, as far as Owen could determine, mostly unconcerned about 4th grade, which was coming. Vivian took a full week off in July for the first time in 4 years, which Rachel greeted with the kind of joy that suggested she'd been waiting for this for longer than a week. There was a Saturday in late July that Vivian would think about later when she was trying to explain to herself what it felt like when a life reorganizes itself around something true. They were at a neighborhood block party, Owen's neighborhood, not hers, though the distinction was becoming increasingly theoretical, given how many Saturday evenings she'd spent in his apartment over the past 7 months. It was the kind of event she would have skipped before, not because she disliked people, but because events without a clear purpose had always seemed like a misallocation of time she could spend on something with a measurable outcome. She'd stopped thinking about time that way, entirely. The block party was loud and pleasant and somewhat disorganized, with a portable speaker that kept playing the same 4 songs in rotation and a grilling situation that Owen was involved in on the grounds that someone needed to be, and Ethan somewhere in the supervised chaos with a group of kids from the building playing a game that had started as tag and evolved over 2 hours into something with considerably more complicated rules. Vivian was standing with a woman named Deb, who lived 2 floors above Owen and was, as far as Vivian could tell, a person who knew everyone in a 3-block radius and took quiet pleasure in connecting them. Deb had the specific social intelligence of someone who reads rooms for a living, and she watched Vivian watching Owen at the grill with the expression of someone confirming a long-held theory. "He's been different this year," Deb said, not unkindly. "Different how?" Vivian asked. "Less—" Deb thought about it. "He was very self-contained before, which is fine. That's just how he is. But you could tell there was a locked room somewhere." She paused. "It's less locked." Vivian looked at Owen across the block party, talking to someone she didn't recognize, easy in the way he was easy with people, that unhurried directness that managed to be warm without performing warmth. He said something, and the other person laughed, and Owen smiled. The real one, the one she'd cataloged the first night at Linden and Frost as different from all the other ones. "He's a good man," Vivian said, simply not as a performance. "He is," Deb agreed. "And he's been trying to be good for so long, mostly just for Ethan's sake, that I think he forgot he was allowed to be good for his own." Vivian sat with that for a moment. She thought about all the ways a person could run on obligation for so long that the obligation became the only fuel they recognized. The way she'd built her own life around forward motion, achievement, control, the next thing, and the next thing. Because forward motion was the one direction that felt safe. You couldn't be blindsided by what was ahead of you if you were always already moving toward it. What she hadn't accounted for was how much she'd been missing while she was moving. Not the dramatic things. The small, ordinary, specific ones. A man's face when he found something funny. A child explaining aerodynamics in his sleep. A cat settling onto your lap with the authority of someone who decided this was now her territory and the matter was not up for discussion. You couldn't schedule those things. You couldn't optimize toward them. They required you to be in a place long enough for them to find you. She'd been in motion for so long, and she'd finally, this past year, stopped long enough. Ethan came looking for her near the end of the afternoon, appearing at her elbow with the directness he brought to most things. "I told Maya's mom that your company does infrastructure stuff," he said. Vivian looked at him. "Did you?" "She's on the city planning committee. She said she'd been trying to find someone to talk to about the transit corridor project on the east side." He looked pleased with himself in a moderate way, not gloating. "I gave her your card. I had one from when you left them at our house." "You carry my business cards." "I carry one, in my backpack, in case." He shrugged as if this were an obvious precaution. "You're not mad?" "I'm not mad. It's a real connection. I did research." "You did research on the East Side Transit Corridor." "I looked it up after she mentioned it last month." He said it with no particular pride, just as a fact about what he did with information that interested him. "It seemed like something you'd want to know about." Vivian looked at this child, who had named a cat after a condiment and carried her business card in his backpack and done background research on city planning projects on the off chance it became relevant, who had sat in a break room and filed away a name and a phrase and known, without being told, that the information had weight. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah?" "You're going to be very good at a lot of things." He considered this. "I know," he said, with the calm certainty of someone who has assessed the available evidence and reached a conclusion. "But it's good that someone else says it." Owen appeared behind him, one hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder as he passed. "What are you two conspiring about?" "Networking," Ethan said. Owen looked at Vivian. "He made a business connection on my behalf," she said. "He does that," Owen said. "I once came home and found he'd arranged a referral for my plumber." He said it with the specific, resigned fondness of a parent who has long since stopped being surprised. "Come on, they're cutting the cake." Ethan went immediately. Owen stayed a half-second longer, looking at Vivian with the particular quality of attention she'd learned was how he showed things he wasn't saying yet. "You okay?" he asked. "Very," she said. He nodded, reached out and touched her arm, briefly. The kind of touch that wasn't trying to do anything except confirm a connection, the way people touch each other when they're in the same place and glad about it. Then he followed his son toward the cake. The things that changed slowly. That was always how it went. Vivian began leaving the office at a reasonable hour more often than not. Not every day. She wasn't going to perform a conversion she hadn't fully made, but enough that it became a pattern her assistant stopped noting as unusual. She started eating lunch away from her desk 3 times a week. She called Rachel without a specific reason, which Rachel received with undisguised delight and the generous grace of a friend who does not say "I told you so" because she doesn't need to. She learned that Ethan had opinions about everything, and that those opinions were almost always worth engaging with, even when, especially when, they arrived sideways during dinner about something apparently unrelated. She learned that Owen's equivalent of venting was describing a problem in precise mechanical detail until the act of describing it made its solution apparent, and that the correct thing to do was to ask the right questions and not to solve it for him. She learned that Captain Butterscotch was genuinely fond of her and chose to express this through proximity rather than acknowledgement, which felt, frankly, appropriate. She learned things about herself, too, which were harder and slower, that she'd been confusing control with safety for most of her adult life, that the things she'd been most afraid of, needing people, being known by them, being wrong in front of them, were in fact the things that made the other things worth doing. That trust wasn't a calculated risk you extended after sufficient evidence. It was a decision you made and then built evidence for, and the making of it was the thing. This was not comfortable knowledge. It didn't arrive in a single clear moment and stay put. It came back every time she had to choose between her instinct to manage and her actual desire to be present, and some days she managed it better than others. And on the days she didn't, she'd gotten better at noticing and adjusting rather than defending. Owen was patient in the way he was patient with everything. Not without limits, but genuinely unhurried. The patience of someone who understood that real things took time and didn't require you to perform impatience in the meantime. He'd had his own version of the slow learning, the loosening of a self-sufficiency that had served him for years and that he'd had to come to understand as partly a protection and partly a habit and partly just what had been possible when the only person he trusted with his own vulnerability was an 8-year-old. They were both, in their different ways, learning to be less alone. On an evening in late September, the 3 of them sat on the roof of Owen's building. A neighbor had set up chairs up there in the summer and they'd never been taken down. Weathered folding chairs and a small table that had been someone's, and the city was very present from up there. The particular nighttime version of it, lit and continuous and indifferent, in the way cities were, doing what it was going to do regardless. Ethan had brought a blanket and his current book, and was reading in the manner of someone who is technically present in a social situation, but has located a comfortable internal room and is occupying it simultaneously. Owen had a beer, Vivian had wine. The evening was warm for September, the kind of end-of-summer warmth that feels like a reminder. Ethan looked up from his book at some point and said, to no one in particular, I told my class that my dad's friend was part of our family now. Owen and Vivian looked at him. My teacher asked me to write about my family, Ethan said, explaining. He had the mildly defensive quality of someone who'd anticipated a reaction and decided to preempt it. I wrote about Dad and Butterscotch and you. He looked at Vivian. I said friend because I didn't know what word to use, but that's what I meant. What did you mean? Vivian asked. Carefully, but actually asking. Ethan thought about it with the seriousness of someone who has been asked to be precise. That you're someone we have now. He looked at his book, then back up. Like, permanently. Not visiting, just there. The September evening went on around them. The city made its sounds. Captain Butterscotch, who had been allowed onto the roof under strict supervision and the theoretical possibility of removal if she went near the edge, which she had done exactly once with intense purpose before Owen had removed her firmly, was located on the second folding chair, asleep, absolutely not listening. Vivian looked at Ethan and then at Owen, and Owen was looking at her with the expression he'd stopped trying to cover, the one she'd first seen in the library in February through the frosted glass, an unguarded moment she'd been seeing more of ever since. Yeah, Vivian said to Ethan. That's what I meant too. Ethan went back to his book. Owen turned back to the city. Vivian sat with her wine and the warm end-of-summer air and thought about blind dates and winter storms and a jacket that smelled like sawdust and all the invisible threads that had been pulling toward this specific roof, these specific people, for longer than any of them had known. She'd spent most of her adult life building things. Companies, frameworks, portfolios, structures that were designed to function well and last. She was good at building things. She'd understood the work of it, the precision required, the planning, the willingness to maintain what you'd built, even when it was inconvenient. What she hadn't understood, not fully, until this year, was that the things worth building were not always the ones you planned. That some of them arrived sideways, in a snowstorm, at the end of an hour you'd almost given up on. That they required less control and more attention than she'd been willing to give. And that giving it, really giving it, setting down the careful management, and just being in it, was not a vulnerability. It was the whole point. Success had meant, for a long time, the company she'd built, the returns she'd delivered, the decisions she'd made well under pressure. She still believed in those things. She'd fought for them and would fight for them again. But they were not, she understood now, the architecture of her life. They were what she did. They were not what she was. What she was here. On a roof in September, with a man who'd stopped on a dark road because it was the right thing and hadn't stayed for credit. With a kid who carried her business card in his backpack and had told his class she was part of the family now, both of which were probably the most practical forms of love she'd ever been offered. With a cat who was asleep in a chair and had no feelings about any of this but was present nonetheless, which was, in its own way, all any of them were doing. Being present, choosing to stay. It turned out that was most of it. It turned out that was the thing she'd been working toward the whole time and hadn't known to call it that. She sat on the roof and let the evening be what it was. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.